Thank you, Glenn. Hi, everybody. You'll have to forgive me. I do have some throat stuff that interferes with clarity, but I'll do my best if you'll give me some tolerance of my choking from time to time. It's allergy season. So I'm Judy Lavezzi. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date, do you do that here? My sobriety date is August 17th, 1982. And for that, I'm extremely grateful to the God of my understanding that I didn't believe in, the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and some really fabulous sponsorship along the way as well. So, but it had very little to do with me being more deserving or better than. I'm one of those people who came in backwards, not through another program, but I came in through my own defiance and arrogance and antagonistic, and did not believe I belonged here. So my dates are interesting because I have a sobriety date. I have never had a drink since 1982, but I had been coming to you guys for a year. And during that year, amazingly, and I tell people this because I think sometimes we get so polite we forget our own basics. I came to you guys because I was miserable and somebody had invited me and I stayed. It was that simple. I did not come to you out of saying, "Dear God, I can't stop drinking, please help me." I came to you saying, "I don't want to live. Something's wrong. I don't know what it is. But somewhere in here, you folks seem to have answers." So I came and I sat in the corner of a meeting at a club, and I came every day for about a year, continuing to drink, continuing to listen, measuring you. I looked at each and every one of you, deciding whether or not I could hear you or whether you could be trusted, and evaluating you. You know, if people don't think you make judgments and discernments, I think we're always in a place where people are doing exactly that. So I did that for about a year, and I continued to drink. And one of the guys in our community wasn't somebody I had ever met before, but I have met many times since, came to this club, and I think he was doing missionary work. You know, he was a missionary among the many of us that were there. We were heeing and sheeing, and we were acting up, and we were doing we were the 8:30 crazy meeting, and a lot of nonsense. And I was having a very good time. Judy thought she was at a bar without booze, is what it felt like. We were all doing our stuff, and it felt just like a bar without booze. And Bob came with a friend. Now we're at the 8:30 meeting, and I'm all about me, because you know how you are at the beginning. I'm all about me and having a good time. And this guy sat down and he said something that was remarkable to me. He said, "You know, this is an open meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And what that means is that you are all welcome to be here, whatever is your addiction, whatever is your problem. We welcome you, because we are told that we will share our experience, our strength, and our hope. And we want to do that. So if you're an overeater, or you're an addict, or you're a gambler, or you're any one of lots of other organizations based on 12 steps, we welcome you. But if you're an Al-Anon, we welcome you. But if you're an alcoholic, here is where you will find identification. Those other groups, we urge you to take what you learn here and go to the group that you can identify with and cement that identification and help them grow. But here, what we do is we stopped drinking. And having come to meetings for a year, I was stunned. I don't think anybody had ever told me directly that we stopped drinking in Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't know what exactly I thought I was doing in Alcoholics Anonymous, except kind of having my little 1-hour party every night. Flagrantly paying no attention to anything that was going on. And I went home to wrestle with what brought me here, because nobody had ever asked me those questions. Nobody had ever challenged me on a first step. And I tell you that because today I would, 40 years later, I would tell you that I think asking people and helping them figure out their first step might be the most important thing we do. New people don't know who they are, what they are, and I did not. So I went home to wrestle with this stuff, and 2 weeks later, I found myself raising my hand, having had some really amazing awarenesses of what had been going on in my life over the last 20 years. I just didn't know. I saw alcohol as my way of life. I did not see it as the problem. And I had problems. I was, at this point, pretty much unable to work. I was a daily drinker. I was the mother of 4 kids. I was the single mother of 4 kids on food stamps without enough money to feed my kids most of the time. I didn't have a car because I couldn't afford a car. I couldn't afford insurance on a car. I couldn't afford gas on a car. I could barely afford a McDonald's for my children once a month. So, you know, you'd think I might have noticed that something was wrong, but I did not. That something that was wrong was all those other things. It was the governor, the male chauvinist system, it was the economic system, it was the Russian president, it was all kinds of other things, none of which had anything to do with me, because what I saw myself was a big fat victim of the world. I was a victim of all kinds of systems that were systems I couldn't change. The way work went, the way the government went, the way everything was. I was, you know, it was the 80s. I had been through the 60s. You know, everything was available in the 60s. It seemed to me to be a way of life. And I came to you and I sat around for a year or so. And I sat around for 2 years or so. And I stayed sober. And I read the steps on the wall. I read the traditions on the wall. I learned them. I could share on each one of them. And I stayed in that place. And then something happened, because, you know, I am of the belief that in life, something will always happen. That something is always just ahead of what you expected to have happen. But so I was comfortable. I had met him. There's always a him. I had met him, and we were 2 people getting married, holding hands, happy little AA couple, being sober, raising our 6 kids. And trying our best to do God's will, actually. Trying our very best to do God's will. Neither one of us having done an inventory. Neither one of us have made amends. We were each other's programs, really. So we got married, which is what we do a lot of in this program. We got married, him and I started crying, and I couldn't stop crying. And I went to a meeting a day because it was my habit to go to a meeting a day. I had been doing that since the beginning. And only now I sat down and I cried. And sometimes my beloved was holding my hand, and I cried through the meeting, holding his hand. And at about 3 months of married life, he turned to me and he said, is there some place in here I should be getting worried? Like something is not right, you know? And almost within the week, I was invited by a trusted elder in our community, a man greatly respected and that I had met within the last year, who said, Judy, you know, we're going to start a big book study. and I think you should come. Now, bear in mind, I'd been reading the steps. I'd been talking about the steps and the traditions, but I had never actually done one. I thought if I talked about them, that was the same as doing them. In my mind, I had done all the steps intellectually, at least. As you may have guessed by now, I'm a person who has lots of illusions and a little difficulty with reality sometimes. And I was pretty sure that I was a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous, doing nothing, having no thought about anything that was much beyond me. And Don invited me to this big book study. And then he said, well, we're going to meet at 6:30 in the morning in Denver, which was an hour away from my home. And I said, oh, I have a job. I can't come. You know, like, oh, thank God I don't have to go. I can't come. I have this job. I have to be back at work. And he said, no problem. We'll move it up to 6 o'clock in the morning so that you can come. So for a year, at 5 in the morning, I left Boulder and headed to Denver to this big book study. And the miracle of all of that is that by the time that year was over, I was a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was a sober member, having bought in body, mind, spirit, and soul. And it took me 7 years to get there without a drink. And I tell you that story not because that's the way anybody should do anything, but we each have our experience. And what I had brought to this thing was defiance and arrogance, a bunch of beliefs that didn't work anymore, but I didn't know that. I had a bunch of beliefs from being young that were false beliefs too, and a lot of history. A lot of history. I was not a 20-year-old child when I got here, and I had been acting up for a long time. So what we did in this big book study over the course of the year was we did our inventories together. We shared our 5 steps or parts of them with each other, men and women, and the whole thing, because there was felt like this was a place of absolute trust, a place where I could lay down my weapons, you know, let my shoulders go down, and I could be there. I could be who I was. And I opened up. I opened up my life and my spirit. And at the end of that year, I was a different person than I had been for the previous 7 years, even without a drink. I'm of the opinion that God's got something to do with this thing. And I didn't start believing or trusting in the God I believed in, if that makes sense. I was raised in religious homes. I was raised with various religion, is what I'm trying to say. I have a solid 14 years of parochial school education. I have really good family background. My dad died when I was 13, something for which I never forgave God. And so when I got her, and you said, you know, in the book, it says, God is your father, you are his agent. I thought, not me, not me. I'm not signing up for that. God kills the daddies of little girls. And with that in mind, I came to Alcoholics Anonymous with such a prejudice against God that I couldn't get over it. I would, every time they talk about God or third step, my hair was on fire. People would pray about me and for me, and I couldn't do a thing about it. And with some excellent guidance, I began to set down my weapons. My parents, I have an interesting little, it's interesting to me. I have a little mix of backgrounds religiously. My birth father was an Italian, so we went to Catholic schools. My mother is a Protestant Methodist Irish one, and my stepfather was a Russian Jew. So I had all these things as part of my background. We talked about religion all the time. I was comfortable with that. But underneath that, I didn't have a God I could trust. Underneath that, I lost that belief and couldn't get it back. And I held God responsible for the Holocaust and World War II and all kinds of stuff. So it took a lot of your work at every meeting and a lot of your patience at every stinking meeting to put up with me, because, you know, we don't do the steps if we don't get the first step. We don't have to do the steps if we don't get the first step. And then if we don't get the second step, which was a crisis for me, we can't do any of the rest of it successfully. I could bring the body, I was there, but I couldn't do the work of getting better. And that's where I got stuck after that marriage, when I had finally, I didn't know at the time, but later on I realized, and I'd like to tell you this because I think it's a real truism for a lot of us. I was blocked enough that I could not be available for the marriage. I'd had lots of those things. I've had lots of relationships. I've been married, engaged, non-monogamous. I've been all kinds of things, but I had never been married in Alcoholics Anonymous with a commitment that I intended to keep. And the burden of feeling like I was that vulnerable took me over an edge, and I couldn't stop crying. I wasn't available for vulnerability, that essential part of intimacy, and it terrified me. So when we went through the steps and I began to see what had been in the background, what had made up this broken background that I was taking into a new relationship, wasn't new, but into a new phase of this relationship, what I was bringing to it was broken. And I didn't have anything that I could bring that knew how to be a partner in a relationship. And I didn't know how to bring God into that. And what was I going to do with us both being in AA? So it was pretty much, for me, I'm a family person. And for me, having a life which is based in Alcoholics Anonymous meant that it was the life that I brought to Alcoholics Anonymous was the same as the life I brought to my family. And I had all those obstreperous kids. They were all acting out because nobody'd been parented for so long. They were all running themselves. And here we are trying to build a life in AA, in public, visual, in front of people, that was honest. And boy, that was a hard thing to do. We went through the steps, step by step by step. I learned something about traditions, but not a lot. And I was a changed person. And Lou and I went on to have a life that was a marvelous life in sobriety, in service. The two of us got involved, DCM, CPC, we got involved in service and began to do our part, because I was taught that what happens with love, the definition of love, something I struggle with, the definition of love was the active concern for the welfare of that which is loved. And I love AA. And I had an active concern for the welfare of AA. So my sponsorship, the people involved, they were invested in AA personally, and I became that as well. And my husband was in service. Always, we're very different kinds of people. We probably should never normally have mixed, but he's the quiet guy who'd rather be behind the camera or setting up chairs. And I'm the one that forgets the camera and doesn't know how to use it and is usually sitting in one of those chairs or chatting about with a bunch of folks. We're just very, very different energies. And so the two of us have very different programs. I don't mean to tell you that we are each other's sponsors or best friends. But we went along as a really good couple in Alcoholics Anonymous on the principles I'd learned because of that year-long study of the steps, word by word, sentence by sentence, question by question, turning things into questions. Are you convinced? It says in the books. Was I convinced was the question. I don't know about that. We'd have to talk about that some more. Real guidance from somebody with answers and somebody who knew what he was talking about saved my life, really. Not that my life was that fabulous, but I didn't know that. My house was dirty. My kids were dirty. We were poor, all that kind of stuff. Today, I make my bed every morning because I need the representation of what my sober life looks like. It doesn't look like a dirty house. I don't want to, I've never been faithful to anybody in my life. I get to be faithful today. Holy smokes, what a change. What a change. So I would like to be able to tell you in the remaining time that I have how wonderful Alcoholics Anonymous has been in all of my affairs, in all of my life, in all of my business. But in fact, that's far from the truth. We were sober, doing our little sober happy dance for quite a while. I attend some women's things, but mostly I go to meetings, mixed meetings, and I don't do just women's stuff. And we were invested in our little community. We helped start central office. We've been really involved, and life was beautiful. And at about, I don't remember, one of my sponsees was about, well, anyway, somewhere along the line, Lou and I began to get crosswise of each other. Now, I'm not his first wife. He's not my first husband. We both know how that works, but we were deeply in AA love. And we started getting distant, and I didn't like him much, and he didn't like me much. And we started picking at each other. And never in any of my meditation did I ever get the sense that I was supposed to leave this guy. I thought, we've got 6 kids. What are we going to do about 6 kids? I don't want to give them the example that it's okay just to get married and divorced every 3rd time, That isn't the way I wanted to present life to my children. And so we had a couple years where we were barely speaking to each other. And my conclusion was I couldn't divorce him because I didn't want to embarrass my children and myself, not to embarrass me, but I'd have to kill him. So I found myself Googling how to smother someone, how long it would take to smother a big guy. And I researched it for a week or more, trying to figure out how I was going to kill this guy and not have to go to jail, because I didn't want to leave those kids I loved so much that I had ignored for so long, right? God. Well, I'm happy to say that we both had sponsors. Eventually, we both got some direction in a different direction, and we left that. I mean, it was so bad that my brain was exploding at night. Instead of being able to sleep, I had little voices sitting on a couch in the corner saying, "It's about time you woke up. We're talking about your marriage." That kind of absolute insanity was going on all the time. Obviously, I had to kill him. But he's a big guy, and holding a pillow down long enough to smother somebody just before you do your research, it's really hard to do, because you got to have them almost be an invalid and not fight back. So we gave up on that idea and decided we had to figure something else out. Called my sponsor one last time, sort of desperate, whining like I did to the people that would listen. I knew enough not to take my unhappiness to my group, because we both went to the same group. So I had people in a couple of different states that I could whine to. When one got tired, I could move to the next one. And I whined to all of them about things. And I finally called my sponsor, who had run out of patience. And he said, "Why don't you just try being a wife?" And I had no idea what that was. I didn't know what that meant. It's like when somebody gives you a definition and you strike out into clouds. I didn't know what that meant. What was I supposed to do or be in that case? And I didn't know what it was. So I started to piece together some stuff. And what I want to tell you is that eventually, what really worked for me was to figure out the traditions. and to apply them in my life in a way that said, oh, here's me, here's our purpose, here's our little group, here's how I take care of it. How am I separate? When is it my business? When is it not my business? How do I support myself emotionally, financially, physically, spiritually, and mentally, like our seventh tradition says? How do I do these things? And when do I work with others in a way that is useful? How do I nurture and care for the group that is here as my really smallest home group? And I started incorporating those into how I viewed the things in my marriage that I had backwards. This is not an Al-Anon talk. This is a straight AA talk. I've never been to an Al-Anon meeting of any size. So I'm not trying to do that. But what I'm telling you is that when one is broken kind of emotionally at the beginning, those things don't necessarily unravel just because you're sober. But I do believe that the book and the program and sponsorship can work together to heal all of the stuff that we got going on. And, you know, I was not a well-behaved person. And this one, I was trying really hard to make an AA success story. So along the way, we have raised 6 kids. Along the way, we have, and they're all, only one is an alcoholic. The rest of them didn't make it. But we're looking at a couple of grandkids and wondering if they might, you know, get the spark. But we don't know. Along the way, I've made amends and he's made amends, and we've had money and we've lost money. We've had the big house, the wonderful house that I love so much. And then we have a smaller house. So I want to tell you a little bit about that. Back when I was drinking, I was in college when I was at my heaviest first bout of drinking. And I found myself pregnant and dropping out of school and giving the baby away. That's the short story. And years later, I get sober, and I've heard a lot of your stories. And those stories look like my stories, amazingly. And a lot of those stories involve being some part of either the child or the parent or the receiver of an adoption. So I decided that since sometimes our people are worried about, oh, did somebody not want me? I needed to make amends. So it was, we were holding a 9th step group at our house for all of us that were reluctant to make amends. So we had people, we'd sit around a table on a Saturday morning for an hour and try to encourage each other to complete our amends. Well, we had people that were color coordinating their amends list, and we had people that were date coordinating it. We can find so many ways to postpone doing anything we really didn't want to do in the first place, but we attended because we knew we should. And so I was talking about this resentment that I had never been able to heal, this terrible circumstance that happened. And I didn't know what to do about it. And I decided 2 things. I had to make peace somehow with the father of the child, and I had to find the child. So I set off on a 5-year route, if you will, to locate the child and to offer to make amends. Strictly AA, well done, all that kind of thing, well-intentioned anyway. And of course, along the way, a little ego gets involved in that. I could handle this. So I stalked him. I found him. I hired some folks to locate this child, and we found him. And I wrote him a letter. And because I had good sponsorship, I wrote him a defensible letter that said, you might be this person. And here's why I think so. And if I'm wrong, you know, just forgive me. So I knew it was him. And turns out he did not know he was adopted. And a couple of weeks after I sent him this letter, I received a letter back, or I received a phone call, not a letter. And I can remember it like it was yesterday. I had prayed about this. I had so much emotion in this. I can't tell you, so much emotion. kept turning it over to God, and I'd go to meetings and I'd say, here's what I did, and God's in charge, and no matter how it turns out, it's going to be okay. No matter how it turns out, I'm all right because God and I are together on this. God and I are buds. Except that he called and he said, I don't want anything to do with you. And I didn't until that moment realize that it had never occurred to me that he wouldn't want to meet me. So all of my prayers, like God and I are buds, all included the fact that it was going to go the way I thought it was going to go, and God was shining upon us one more time. I didn't even consider that there might be another plan. So I'm on the couch, sobbing, because in AA, you have made me into somebody I wasn't ashamed to introduce to a child I gave away. I was not ashamed of me. I was no longer that person. And the phone rang. And one of the guys from the club where I'd gotten sober called to say, Judy, I hadn't talked to you in a while. I just wanted to tell you that if nobody has told you they love you today, I love you. Your being in this world matters. I thought, well, there's a coincidence for you. The moment when I don't think my life matters, somebody calls. And then he said, my wife, Eileen, has just had a stroke. We think it's a stroke. We have her. We're at the hospital. And she doesn't even know her own name. But she knows yours. And she wanted me to ask if you would come and give her a hug. And I heard that little voice we so seldom hear. And that little voice was, you don't always get to choose, but I will never leave you alone. You will always have what you need. And that belief has stuck with me. I'm basing my life on it. I will have what I need. I went from this person who blamed God for everything to somebody who knows to their bones that I will have what I need. No matter what happens in life, I will have what I need. But I have to dig kind of deep for it sometimes. I have to let go of a whole lot of other things in order to find that place. So that taught me next step. I keep having one experience and then another experience. They're not so close together that it was like it was my first 2 years, which I hope never to repeat. But they keep happening, and I'm grateful for that, because it reminds me that I'm alive, I'm recovering, I'm getting better, and that with each year that passes and each challenge that passes, it's always something new. It's never the old thing one more time, by the way. You're probably experiencing the same thing. It's never the same thing exactly twice. You can't step your foot into the same river twice. It's always different. So I had been at my job for 18 years when they decided I wasn't necessary anymore. It was a year after my husband's job had decided it was going to reorganize, and he got spun out. And we had the big house. We had the big house. It was big enough to fit all of our kids. And to start, Alcoholics Anonymous Central Office started in our front room in Boulder, Colorado. And not that we started anything, but it was the kind of house where people would come. It was that kind of house. It was the house people came to, where they were warm, they were fed, we had group meetings, we were around the table, that kind of house. And I love that. I'm a family person, and you are my family, and having you around was just we even had parties and dances and weddings. We had that house, but we couldn't afford that house anymore. And here we are. We have sobriety. We've done service. We've come to believe in God. We have sponsorship. We sponsor others, and we don't have any jobs. And the next challenge is, now what? Now what? Do you trust God with this or not? So I came home the day I lost my job, and, I'm in tears. And my husband looked at me, thank God for wisdom in the book. And he said, well, who's your employer anyway? And that was the next piece. So we were in a place where, because it was a big house, and because it was an old house, which I adore, I wanted, it would have taken a lot of money to put in modern good windows, to do some of the work that needed to be done to keep this home where it should be kept. And we didn't feel like, without jobs, either one of us had the right to let the house go to pieces. It was an AA home. People cried when we sold our house within 6 months of that decision. And we bought ourselves a townhouse, the townhouse I'm speaking to you in. And it's serviceable. It wasn't my home, and it's serviceable. So I lost my job, and I lost my house. And one more time, at some rich vein of sobriety, I get to wrestle with the big issues of my life, my identity, and who am I in Alcoholics Anonymous? Who am I, God? Who am I in the world? Who's Judy Levesey today? Because all the things that I have put my faith and trust in making me are different. I had to leave my district, my home group. I kept my home group, but I'm not physically there. And I know intellectually that a job does not define me. But when I didn't have a job, I didn't have a definition either. Because it is our American style to say, who are you and what do you do? And I'd lost me. I had no idea how much of me was invested in a dependency on something else one more time. And I started reading Bill's, emotional sobriety essay, one of his best essays ever. And I started realizing how dependent I was on being, it's not like I had an important job, but it was a definition of who I was and how I was in this world. And I didn't know what to do with me without it. And then we made this heart-rending decision to sell my home and move. And I had to one more time. I spent 2 years mourning, no job, no house, who am I? No job, no house, who am I? And coming to grips with finding my place with the God of my understanding, with the husband of my understanding, with the AA of my community, and finding myself I'm now doing, thank God for small favors, I'm now doing a gratitude with 3 or 4 women on a daily basis to remind me and them and each other of how many small things there are to be grateful for and how many big things there are to be grateful for. Because I was taught a grateful heart seldom drinks. And being a victim to life is deadly. And I don't want to be there, but I didn't know how to not be there. And one more time, I had to work all the way through. And the way I do that is I do that with sponsees because we're in the book all the time. So I get to go through that with them and share the same kinds of goofy thinking that are part of every one of our goofy thinking sets. Some of us are goofier than others, and I'm probably one of those, and no question if you ask my husband or my kids. Anyway, so I get to go back and use the very tools that have never been very far away because of that huge gift of sponsorship. It is the sponsorship that keeps me anchored, one on each side. It is sponsorship, receiving and giving, that allows me to see something that I didn't know for a long time. And that was that when I got sober, they used to say, God wants me to be here. There was a parking place. God gave me a parking place. God chooses my cigarettes. And I keep thinking, maybe if God was choosing, he wouldn't choose cigarettes. But it's just a thought. And I've had all these ideas in my head all of these years And then when all of those things are taken away from you or are gone, they weren't taken away, they were gone. My fallback is I want to be a victim. And I have been taught by you and people like you that that's a deadly place for me to be. And that's when I need to dive deeper into my sponsorship, into my program, and into what Alcoholics Anonymous is for me, is this lifeline, this place of truth. So one more time, I got to be able to do that and have done that. When I've done service work, I tell my sponsees, I am so over busy, I'm crazy. But don't you leave now, because I need you to keep me balanced. I need you to remind me that somebody needs to make coffee, and maybe I'm it. And that I'm not it because I'm important, I'm it because I need to be here with you, and I'm grateful for the privilege of doing that. So maybe the last piece of talking about that is that, Chris, this is really kind of funny when I think about it. Christmas Eve at 5 o'clock at night, I got a call from my doctor who said, oh, you know that mammogram you had, that biopsy you had? Well, I'm leaving on vacation for 2 weeks, but I wanted you to know that you have breast cancer. I'll be back in 2 weeks. Christmas Eve. So I'm a healthy person normally. I think of myself as a healthy person. I think of myself as physically an enduring person with a few breathing problems, okay? But I'd never, ever once considered that I was a person who could even get breast cancer. Nobody in my family's ever had it. But I did the mammogram. I followed the directions. I was sort of nonchalant. I'll never have that. Nobody in my family's ever had that. And I'm not resentful because I think there's some connection there. So I'm not resentful. I don't have resentments. I'm okay. I'll do all the tests you want. And then she says, I've got it. I mean, like, what? What? No, that can't be true. Well, it turned out it was true. And I did have breast cancer. And so for the first 3 months of this year, I was doing lots of doctors because the medical industry is pretty messed up. Lots of doctors, lots of insurance, lots of everything, and then radiation and all that stuff. And because I don't have to stop sponsoring people and I don't have to stop being sponsored, I am surrounded in a community of my fellows. My family ties go deep, and I am surrounded on a daily basis. So I don't have to get too far from the program. So people would call and say, what do you need? I don't need a thing. I'm good. I'm good. And I really am good. And I really don't expect it to come back. And I've made some decisions about it. And I don't expect it to be a problem. And if it is, I guess we deal with it. But I feel really upbeat about the whole thing with a couple of exceptions. And those exceptions are, I got my will sitting on top of my desk, and I'm cleaning out my closets just in case. Because nobody needs 30 years worth of clothes and books, boxes of books that maybe I won't read. There's some reality, and I feel really okay with that. And the reason I tell you that is that I'm okay with that because you have shown me how to do that. 3 of my sponsors have died, and all 3 of them have shown me how to walk into the big meeting with dignity and grace and trust. Each of them has shown me the way personally so that they are embedded in my bones. And I hope that when the time comes for me, with or without, whenever that is, if it's 15 years from now, whenever that time is, that I would have their courage, that I would have their sense of value, their sense of dignity, and their absolute lack of fear, because fear is such a huge component in all the work that we do. I've not had to write about fear of this cancer. Fear of dying, it's not there. What I am is fear of not having lived enough, Fear of not getting the 3 books I've written since I lost that job published. Fear of not having been useful. That's the kind of fear I have today. Fear of not having made my life count. But the sense of today is that it's full. It's filled with joy and gratitude. And so my program has kept on with me. And I'm one of those people who's really fortunate. And you may not be that person, but I have always gotten a lot out of an AA meeting. I'm not one of those people who's just disgusted that they have to be here. I have always gotten something out of an AA meeting, and I appreciate your stories, and I appreciate your life, and I can apply it to my own. And it gives me courage, and it gives me faith, and it gives me hope. And for that, I'm really grateful. Thank you so much to have allowed me the opportunity to share, for Glenn to have invited me, and for your kind and polite